Imagine waking up in the dead of night. You are surrounded by sub-zero Siberian winds, trapped in the freezing dark of the Ural Mountains. You are a seasoned survivalist. You have faced blizzards, bears, and frostbite before. But tonight, something is different. Something is outside, or worse, something is inside your tent with you. You are so utterly terrified of whatever this is that you don't even reach for the zipper. You don't reach for your coat. You don't grab your boots. You grab a knife, you slash your way out through the thick canvas, and you run out into the pitch-black darkness, completely barefoot. In the winter of 1959, 9 experienced hikers did exactly that. Deep in the remote Ural Mountains of Russia sits a peak known to the indigenous Mansi people as Kholat Syakhl. Translated into English, it means dead mountain. For decades, this frozen wasteland has kept a gruesome secret. When search parties finally found this team's campsite, they didn't find victims of a standard hiking accident. They found a slaughterhouse of impossible clues. Tents ripped open from the inside. Footprints walking calmly into negative 30-degree blizzards. Bodies with injuries comparable to a high-speed car crash, yet without a single scratch on their skin. Today, we are going to retrace their final, terrifying footsteps. We will examine the classified Soviet files, the bizarre radiation found at the scene, and the gruesome autopsies that made medical examiners tremble. I warn you right now, what you are about to hear defies all logic, and by the end of this video, you will be left with an unanswered question that will keep you awake tonight. This is the story of the well-known Dyatlov Pass incident. Welcome. This is the corporate narrator, bringing you the most gripping true stories out there. If you love deep dives, dark twists, and stories that stay with you long after they end, make sure you like and subscribe. Help us grow our channel, because every new subscriber fuels the next unforgettable story. And trust me, the next one starts now. Our story begins in January 1959 at the Ural Polytechnical Institute in Sverdlovsk. A ski and hiking team of 10 students and alumni boarded a train headed for the extreme northern wilderness. Let me be absolutely clear, this was not a casual weekend trip for amateur campers. Every single member of this group was a highly trained Grade 2 certified hiker. Completing this incredibly dangerous 200-mile trek through the frozen taiga would earn them Grade 3 status, the highest, most prestigious survival certification in the entire Soviet Union. They were strictly disciplined, no alcohol, no cigarettes, just pure, unbreakable focus. To understand the sheer tragedy of what happened on Dead Mountain, you have to understand exactly who was on that mountain. These weren't just names on a classified document. They were the absolute best of the best. Leading the expedition was 23-year-old Igor Dyatlov. Igor was a radio engineering student, brilliant, confident, and deeply respected. He was known for being a strict leader, but a fair one. He had survived treacherous mountain conditions before, and his team trusted him implicitly with their lives. Then there was Zinaida Kolmogorova, 22 years old. She was the heart and soul of the group. Everyone loved Zina. She was an experienced hiker who had once been bitten by a viper on a previous trip and hiked for days in agonizing pain without complaining once. She was tough as nails but incredibly warm. Lyudmila Dubinina was the youngest at 20. She was a fierce, dedicated communist and an athletic powerhouse. Like Zina, she had survived horrific conditions before, once taking a hunting shotgun blast to the leg by accident on an expedition and surviving the long trek back to civilization. Alexander Kolovatov, 24, was a meticulous and serious nuclear physics student. He was the kind of guy who did everything by the book. If you needed someone to keep a level head in a crisis, it was Alexander. Rustem Slobodin, 23, was a quiet, athletic young man. He was known for his incredible endurance, often running long distances in the freezing snow, just for fun. He brought his mandolin on the trip to play music by the campfire. Yuri Krivonyshenko, 23, was the group's joker, always smiling, always trying to lift everyone's spirits. Behind his jokes, though, he was a brilliant engineer who worked at a highly classified Soviet nuclear facility. Yuri Doroshenko, 21, was a giant of a man. Towering and incredibly strong, he was Zenaida's former boyfriend. They had remained close friends, and Doroshenko was the muscle of the group, capable of carrying the heaviest loads. Nikolai Thibault Brignol, 23, had the most tragic backstory. The descendant of a French communist, Nikolai was actually born in a Soviet gulag camp. Despite his dark beginnings, he had a razor-sharp wit and was known for keeping the team laughing when morale was low. And finally, the wild card of the group, Semyon Zolotaryov. At 38 years old, he was significantly older than the rest of the college students. He was a seasoned combat veteran of World War II. He had strange tattoos that he refused to explain, and he insisted the group call him Sasha instead of his real name. He was thrust into the group at the last minute because he needed the Grade 3 certification for his career as a professional wilderness guide. These were the 9 who would die, but originally there was a 10th. Just a few days into the trek, on January 28th, 21-year-old Yuri Yudin began suffering from agonizing joint pain. The freezing temperatures flared up a chronic condition he had, and the pain became so severe that he was physically forced to turn back. Yuri hugged his friends goodbye. He took a few final photographs of them smiling in the snow. He watched them disappear into the white snowy tree line, feeling a deep sense of disappointment that he couldn't join them. He had no idea that his illness had just saved his life. Now reduced to 9 members, the group pushed deeper into the Siberian taiga. The wilderness here is unforgiving. Endless stretches of white snow, dense pine forests, and a silence so profound it can make your ears ring. They documented their journey meticulously. They took dozens of photos. They wrote in their diaries every night by the campfire. For days, everything was perfectly normal, just bitter cold, howling winds, and heavy snow. They were laughing, they were making good time. But by February 1st, they reached the foot of Koletshakal, Dead Mountain. As they began their ascent up the mountain pass, the weather violently turned. A massive snowstorm rolled in. Visibility dropped to absolute zero. The blistering wind whipped the snow into a blinding whiteout, throwing the experienced navigators off course. Instead of navigating around the base of the mountain as planned, they accidentally wandered directly onto its exposed, treacherous, sloping face. Realizing his mistake, Igor Dyatlov made a critical and highly debated decision. Instead of retreating a mile back down the slope into the safety of the dense forest, where the trees would block the freezing wind, he ordered the team to pitch their tent right there, on the steep, unprotected slope. Perhaps he didn't want to lose the altitude they had gained. Perhaps they were just too exhausted to backtrack. Whatever the reason, the 9 hikers dug into the snow and set up their large canvas tent. It was late afternoon. They were exhausted, but safe. They changed out of their heavy, wet winter gear. They ate a simple dinner of cold bacon, biscuits, and ham. They cracked jokes, wrote their final diary entries, climbed into their heavy sleeping bags, and waited for morning. But morning never came. Before leaving, Igor Dyatlov had told Yuri Yudin, the survivor, to expect a telegram by February 12th. It would be their signal that they had made it back to civilization. February 12th came. Nothing. February 15th came. Still nothing. Total silence. By February 20th, the hikers' families were panicked. They demanded action. The Soviet military was called in. Helicopters scoured the mountains from above. Military search parties and local mansi hunters on skis probed the deep snow below. Finally, on February 26th, a search party spotted something half buried in the snow on the desolate slopes of Dead Mountain. It was the tent. But as the rescuers approached, the bitter wind seemed to carry a profound sense of dread. The tent was partially collapsed, covered in a thin layer of snow. Inside, they found the hikers' heavy winter boots lined up perfectly. Their thick coats were folded. Their axes, their knives, their cameras, and their food were all exactly where they should be, all perfectly organized, but the hikers were gone. Investigators noticed something chilling about the canvas tent. It had been sliced open with a knife, but the cuts were not made from the outside. The tent hadn't been attacked. The cuts were made from the inside. Whatever happened in that tent terrified these seasoned survivalists so badly, so instantly, that they didn't even take 2 seconds to use the zipper. They violently carved their way out of the fabric and hurled themselves into a negative 30-degree blizzard. Without their coats, without their boots, without their survival gear. Rescuers found 9 sets of footprints leading away from the shredded tent. Some wore only thin socks. Some had a single shoe. Some were entirely barefoot, pressing their naked skin into the freezing ice. But here is where the suspense begins to curdle your blood. If you are terrified enough to slash your way out of a tent, you run, you scatter, you panic. But the footprints did not show people running in chaotic panic. They were walking calmly, orderly, single file, straight down the slope, heading toward the dark, ominous tree line, a full mile away. What could possibly make 9 experts abandon their life-saving shelter, barefoot in a blizzard, and walk calmly toward the dark woods? The search party followed the barefoot tracks down the slope. The trail disappeared occasionally under the blown snow, but the trajectory was clear. It led to the edge of the dense forest, specifically to a massive ancient cedar tree standing on the edge of the tree line. Beneath its sprawling branches, searchers found the remnants of a tiny improvised campfire. And lying right next to the freezing ashes were the first 2 bodies. It was the giant, Yuri Doroshenko, and the jokester, Yuri Krivonishenko. They were wearing nothing but their underwear. No coats, no pants, no shoes, in temperatures cold enough to freeze human skin in minutes. But it was the state of their bodies that deeply disturbed the searchers. Their hands were brutally burned, not just blistered, charred. It looked as though they had frantically shoved their bare hands directly into the fire, trying to stay warm, completely numb to the burning of their own flesh. Above them, the branches of the massive cedar tree were snapped off, up to 15 feet high. Skin and blood from their hands and legs were found frozen to the rough tree bark. They hadn't just climbed the tree to break off branches for firewood. You don't climb 15 feet in the air for kindling. They had climbed it in a desperate, bleeding panic, looking out for something in the dark. But the horror didn't stop there. Between the massive cedar tree and the slashed tent up the hill, the searchers found 3 more bodies spread out in the snow. It was the leader, Igor Dyatlov, the beloved Zinaida Kolmogorova, and the athletic Rustem Slobodin. They were frozen solid in poses of desperate crawling. They were facing the tent. After fleeing to the woods, they had realized they were going to freeze to death. These 3 had made the heroic, doomed decision to try and crawl back up the mountain, into the teeth of the blizzard, to retrieve their coats. They didn't make it. Igor was found with birch branches clutched tightly in his frozen fists. Rustem had a minor fracture on his skull, likely from falling on the ice. Zinaida had a long bruise on her side, as if she had been struck by a baton. At this point, the official Soviet autopsy ruled that all 5 of these hikers had died of hypothermia, a tragic, desperate, but seemingly explainable freezing death. But the investigators had a massive, looming problem. They had only found 5 bodies. Where were the other 4? For 2 grueling months, the snow on Dead Mountain refused to melt. The families waited in agony. The searchers probed the snow every single day, finding absolutely nothing. Finally, in May, the spring thaw began to reveal the hidden landscape. Deep in the woods, about 75 meters away from the cedar tree, the snow melted enough to reveal a steep, rocky ravine. Under 10 feet of dense, packed snow, the searchers finally found the remaining 4 members of the group. When the medical examiners pulled the bodies from the ice, the entire tone of the investigation shifted. They realized this was no longer a simple case of hypothermia. This was something entirely different, something deeply sinister. Unlike the first 5 bodies, these 4 hikers were wearing layers of thick clothes. But they weren't their own clothes. The group had violently ripped the pants and sweaters off the dead bodies of their friends under the cedar tree, wrapping the garments around themselves in a desperate bid to stay warm. But their clothing wasn't what terrified the doctors. It was their injuries. Nikolai Thibault Brignol, the man born in the Gulag, had a massive, fatal skull fracture. His skull was shattered so severely that bone fragments had been driven into his brain. The veteran, Semyon Zolotaryov, had a violently crushed chest cavity. 5 of his ribs were snapped in half. Lyudmila Dubinina, the youngest of the group, had 10 severely fractured ribs. The trauma to her chest was so extreme that it caused massive internal bleeding, tearing her heart. The Soviet medical examiner, Boris Vozrojdeny, stepped out of the autopsy room trembling. He noted in the official, classified files that the immense force required to break their bones, this severely was equivalent to being hit by a speeding freight train or experiencing a horrific, high-speed car crash. Yet, there was absolutely no external trauma. Let me repeat that. There were no bruises on their skin, no scrapes, no external tissue damage, no signs of a fistfight, no signs of an animal attack, no signs of falling off a cliff. It was as if an immense, invisible pressure had simply wrapped around them and crushed them from the inside out. And then came the scariest discovery of all, the detail that turns this tragedy into a nightmare. When investigators looked at the faces of the final victims pulled from the icy ravine, they recoiled in horror. Alexander Zolotaryov, the hardened war veteran, was missing both of his eyes. His empty eye sockets stared blankly at the morgue ceiling. Lyudmila Dubinina, her eyes were missing as well, but even worse, something that still gives researchers chills to this day. Her tongue had been entirely removed. The autopsy explicitly stated that the diaphragm of her mouth and her tongue were missing, gone. And based on the blood found in her stomach, the medical examiner concluded it had been removed while she was still alive. To make matters completely incomprehensible, government testers took the strange, mismatched clothing found on the bodies and scanned them with a Geiger counter. The needle went wild. 3 articles of clothing belonging to these hikers were emitting incredibly high, unexplained levels of beta radiation. How is this possible? Why did they flee their only shelter in a calm, orderly fashion? What crushed their bones with the force of a car crash but left their skin untouched? Why were their eyes and tongues missing? And where, in the middle of the desolate Siberian wilderness, did the radiation come from? For over 60 years, the greatest minds on Earth have tried to solve the Dyatlov Pass incident. Some claim it was a freak avalanche or a slab avalanche that crashed onto the tent, forcing them to cut their way out. But an avalanche wouldn't explain why they walked calmly away. It wouldn't explain the missing eyes and tongue, and it certainly doesn't explain radioactive clothing. Some claim it was an encounter with the Russian Yeti, pointing to a mysterious dark figure captured in one of the hikers' very last photographs, a blurry shape lurking in the trees. Others point to secret Soviet weapons testing. Another hiking group camped 30 miles away reported seeing massive glowing orange spheres hovering in the night sky on the exact date and time the hikers died. Did the group witness a classified nuclear or chemical missile test? Did an airborne weapon deploy overhead, sucking the oxygen from the air, burning their hands, and causing them to rip off their clothes in a state of delirious fever? The Soviet government's actions only fueled the fire of these conspiracies. They immediately sealed all the files. They declared the mountain strictly off-limits to everyone for 3 full years. They shut down the investigation abruptly and forcefully. The lead investigator, a man named Lev Ivanov, was directly ordered by high-ranking Soviet officials to completely bury the case. Years later, after the fall of the Soviet Union, Ivanov gave an interview on his deathbed. He confessed that he believed those glowing orbs in the sky directly killed the hikers. He believed it was a UFO, or a highly advanced weapon. When the Soviet government finally closed the criminal case in May of 1959, they didn't blame an avalanche. They didn't blame an animal. They didn't blame hypothermia. The official, classified conclusion to the criminal case was sealed with a single, incredibly cryptic sentence. They concluded that Igor Dyatlov and his 8 friends died because of an unknown, compelling force. To this day, nobody knows what that compelling force was. Was it a natural disaster that created a perfect storm of panic? Was it a ruthless government cover-up of a weapons test gone horribly wrong? Or did those 9 hikers encounter something ancient, something protective, or something not of this earth lurking in the snows of Dead Mountain? Whatever it was, it is still out there, waiting in the snow. What do you think really happened to the Dyatlov group? Let me know your best theories in the comments below. If you made it all the way to the end, thank you for watching. Seriously, it means more than you think. Before you go, I want to hear from you. What story should we cover next? And how can we make these videos even better for you? Drop your ideas, feedback, or even the darkest cases you've heard of down in the comments. Help us grow this channel into something unforgettable. And until the next story, stay curious.